Good morning! My first video for you guys. I hope you're excited. So there's two things I want to go through on the video, and that is the two different models that we use for this part of hazards. They're really, really important models, and we'll use them and refer back to them every time we do a case study because they will expect you to be able to apply the theoretical models to a real life situation. So the first one, and again you'll have a nice better picture of it on the slides, is the disaster risk management cycle, which, if I grab the textbook, looks a little bit like that. In fact, I'll probably use this rather than the whiteboard. Let me zoom in. Can I do that? Yeah, there we go. So this is our first theoretical model. So in essence, they would use one of these models before a disaster, but then equally they'd implement this after a disaster happened as well, probably to try and make sure the disaster was lessened for another further event. So you start off pre-disaster over here. So before a disaster happens, say you were living in a region of the world where you regularly get tropical storms, you would, before a potential disaster happened, do a risk assessment. So maybe there's a hurricane that's about 5 days away out in the Atlantic Ocean, and you're East Coast USA, and you know it's probably going to hit somewhere near you. First thing you do is risk assess. So who's there, who's at risk, what land is at risk, what economic sort of factors are at risk as well, what's the electricity supply going to be like, all the different things that you'd need to prepare for if you were sort of a government official. Then mitigation and prevention. So once you've identified the risk of something, how are you going to potentially stop it happening or try and reduce the risks of it happening? So that might be tropical storms coming. We're going to prepare by handing out sandbags to our community so they can stop the water coming in under the doors, or get community groups together to start boarding up windows, for example. And then preparedness. So perhaps that means setting up an evacuation shelter and filling it with supplies of food and water and basic sort of necessities like blankets or tents or something. And so all the things you do before a disaster happened. Then obviously sometimes the worst does happen and we actually have the disaster. So hopefully there's some sort of warning or mass evacuation, perhaps just before or maybe just after it's happened, depends on the situation. So obviously with an earthquake, you wouldn't be able to evacuate because you can't really predict them. So evacuation might be just after the events happened. If it's a tropical storm, you might evacuate just before the actual disaster. So then you're into the response phase. This is your initial things that you're going to do to try and save lives and prevent the situation getting worse. So first of all, the first thing that anybody does in any sort of disaster is try and save people, so save lives. That might be sending out teams of people with sniffer dogs to try and get people out of the rubble, for example, if there'd been an earthquake. Or it might be sort of taking people from their rooftops if the flooding has got too high. So saving lives and sort of, treating the injured is your first initial priority in response. Providing immediate assistance, that's probably going to be food and water, temporary shelter, that sort of thing. And then assessing the damage. So actually this might be sort of 4, 5, 6 days after the events happened. You would go out and look at the quality of the roads, look which bridges have come down, assess the scale of the flooding, see if you need to put emergency pumps to get the water out, that sort of stuff. And then ongoing assistance. So some people, probably the poorer members of your community, might need some more support than just the initial stuff. So most people in a developed country would have some sort of savings. They might have insurance that will pay for them to be in a hotel, but there may be some people that are a bit poorer that perhaps have nothing left, so they'd need ongoing assistance. Then we get into this post-disaster phase where they attempt to get things back to normal. So you've done your initial responses, you've saved lives, you've made sure everyone is kind of as safe as they can be. Then you start to rebuild your community back to how it was. So restoration of infrastructural services, so putting up power lines again, repairing roads and bridges, reconstruction, so if houses have come down or roofs have blown off, actually starting to sort of rebuild them, and economic and social recovery, so that could be providing sort of therapy for people on an emotional level, or it could be helping businesses get back up and running and on their feet via loans or something. Ongoing development activities, so again, it's probably just more of the previous two things, getting society back to where it was. And then finally, back to the beginning again, risk assessment, mitigation and prevention. So is there things they can put in place so if a disaster were to happen again, they could make it better and reduce the impacts on their people? The thing I like with this model is it just goes through in a nice logical order what people would do. My criticism to this model is I think this is just pretty much common sense. Surely without this model, that is what a government or society would be doing anyway. But I guess it's a way of formalising it. So again, when we're looking at real life events, we'll have a look at, okay, how did they risk assess? How did they prepare before the event? The event happened. What did they do in initial response? And what was the actual ongoing sort of long-term response to get them back to normality? So the second model, I've only got a few minutes left on my phone of recording, so we'll try and do this quickly. If not, I'll have to stop, upload, and then go again. So our second model, and again, you've got a better version of this on your screen on the PowerPoint, is the Park Impact Response Model. And I'm actually going to draw it. And again, you might want to draw it along with me, and I can explain things as we go. Let's get that in the picture and zoom out again. There we go. So axes wise, along the bottom we just have time, and you'll notice on your model that it kind of gives a little bit of a time scale along the bottom, and then you've got a dotted line that comes down like this, which indicates the actual hazard events. So everything before the dotted line is pre-disaster, everything afterwards is post-disaster. On the time at the bottom, you've got the initial response, which is hours to days. Then you've got like a little section which is days to weeks. And then you've got weeks to, if I can squeeze it in there, years. So very, very vague. And there's a reason for that, because this model is vague and allows you to kind of apply it to any situation or any disaster. And then we've got three other sections. We've got a section at the top, a middle section, and then most of our section down the bottom. So this top section is improvement. This is normality in the middle. And this one down here is deterioration. So you can probably guess. Deterioration, there we go. And what this is measuring, so along this axis, I'm not going to write it all because it'll take me forever, is quality of life, level economic activity, social stability, communications and service level. So essentially all the things that would normally go on in terms of businesses and services running, so electricity and phone networks, quality of life of the actual people is all kind of measured on this axis. So again, you can go and jot those things down on your diagram. So that's kind of the setup of it. And then after that, we draw on lines to show what happens during a disaster. So normally with a community, you would start off in your normality section. You might not always start there. So for example, if you're a community that's just been hit by an earthquake, and then 2 weeks later, you are hit by a tropical storm, and we'll look at an example of a place that actually did go through that scenario. You might not start in normality, you might start in deterioration already. But most people will start off in normality, so you're going about your normal life, all of a sudden a hazard disrupts your life forever. And then when we get to the actual hazard, our line will therefore drop, because quality of life and service levels and economic activity is suddenly going to plummet. So for example, you have an earthquake, obviously during an earthquake, quality of life will deteriorate because your home might be destroyed. You're probably not going to go to work for a few weeks whilst you recover. So that line is going to drop. So that's probably in the hours and days, you're going to get the biggest drop in service and quality of life, etc., etc. In the sort of days and weeks afterwards, perhaps it will start to get a little bit better. And at some point, hopefully in weeks to years, normality will sort of resume and you'll start to get back more towards that normal line. And again, most people kind of get back to normality and just stay in normality. But there are variations of this. I've got a whole minute and a half to do this bit. You won't always start in normality, as we've said, and you won't always have such disruption and back to normal. So for example, say you have the earthquake in Iceland, for example, that happened in 2010, I think it was, the one that disrupted all the flights. You may go for Iceland into normality, the hazard happens. Yeah, for a few days, quality of life and services were disrupted, but nowhere near as bad as some other things like the Indonesian tsunami, for example. So perhaps it doesn't drop as far as some other disasters. And then actually, once all the ash had gone, they kind of returned to normality quite quickly. So perhaps their line would look a bit more like that. Then there might be there's some earthquakes in Japan, for example, where actually they, due to an earthquake previously, might have already put in place improved infrastructure and structures of their houses. So they might now have earthquake-proof buildings, which means they're probably not in normality, they're better than normality. Again, they might have a very large earthquake. So when the, I can't remember the year of it now, I think it was 2011, the Japanese tsunami happened, even though they were in improvement, their tsunami wall wasn't big enough and their whole community was devastated. And so actually their line probably dropped very dramatically and very, very low. Loads of people died. It was a very bad situation. It took them a very, very long time to recover. So maybe their line did something like that. They then actually improved their structures, improved their tsunami wall. So they've probably gone even further into the improvement section. So hopefully you can sort of see what we're doing with this. And there's various things that would impact what their line would look like. So we looked at Japan, who's a HIC. We've looked at sort of an Indonesian tsunami, who an LIC, so they'd probably have quite a dramatic drop. And then again, Iceland, who are a HIC, don't have very big eruptions, so quite a low magnitude event, with only a small drop and quite a quick return to normality. I am going to run out of time. So the next task you've got is to look at the next couple of slides after this, which has more factors on how potentially this could be changed. If I were you, I would have a go at drawing some of these lines based on some of those case studies that are on the or examples that are on the next couple of slides. All right, take care. Bye-bye.